I've just come back from Panama, actually. I was there last week for the climate negotiations. And I think the discussion that I'm going to be presenting for you is very much colored by the negotiations and the discussions that we've witnessed in Panama. As you know, there was the third session of the climate change negotiations this year there. And as Aaron pointed out a bit earlier, the situation in the UNFCCC negotiations is somewhat like here in the WTO Doha round negotiations, not really going anywhere anytime fast. There are 3 points I wish to raise. One, how do we see sustainable development and climate change as a global community? Two, how is climate change being addressed by the global community? Three, what are the economic implications of addressing climate change? And four, what's the role of intellectual property in this discussion? Because the intellectual property is popping up in the climate negotiations. First, how do we see climate change? Do we really see it as a crisis? And Aaron has pointed out that we've had empirical studies, for example, coming from the IPCC that do point out that in fact there is an environmental crisis and that is already hitting us. I come from the Philippines, and I'm sure you've seen CNN and BBC over the past couple of weeks, which have actually shown that in a space of 1 week, we've had 2 major typhoons, which is not that unusual now for the past 5 years, but if you were to compare it over a timeline of the past 25 years, having that frequency and that intensity of typhoons really is something. So I think the empirical scientific basis for saying climate change has happened is here, and I think no one denies that. But the issue is, for us as a global community, what do we do about it? Are we still chugging along at a business as usual approach? Or are we really seeing this as an opportunity for action? And the answer to that, sadly for now, at least since Bali in 2007, is that it really has not prompted that much in terms of very deep action, especially in the part of those that are supposed to take the lead on it. If one were to read the UNFCCC, both in terms of its spirit and its letter. Which brings me to the second point. When we address climate change and we look at sustainable development, there is already a context for that, which we need to understand, I think. One is that you have a sustainable development context, and for that the global community already has an existing framework. You have that framework coming out in the Rio Principles, for example. You have that framework which came out from Agenda 21. And in addressing climate change, you already have that existing framework as well. It's the UNFCCC. And what that framework implies for both of these instruments, which are also relevant to the discussion here in the WTO on trade and investment and climate change, insofar as these instruments are implicitly referred to, for example, in the objective towards promoting sustainable development that the WTO professes, is that you have a package of actions that both developed and developing countries are supposed to take together. One is that you're supposed, as a global community, developed and developing countries have to undertake emission reductions, albeit in differentiated ways, with developed countries, because of historical responsibility, undertaking emission reductions in a binding manner, and developing countries undertaking emission reduction to the extent that they are able. There are 2 other key elements to this package in addition to emission reductions. One is the provision of finance and the provision of technology, and the other one is the provision of technology from developed to developing countries, and you see this actually in the UNFCCC. And the fourth element there is this issue of transparency, of how we report to each other that we are actually doing the things that we are doing. Because this underlies the framework, that we are able to report, that we are transparent with each other, that we are actually fulfilling our respective obligations in terms of emission reductions, and developed country obligations to developing countries in terms of providing finance and technology transfer to help developing countries actually do more and contribute more towards this global problem. Now, the The key issue here then is because of this balance, this package that we see, the climate change negotiations has become converted from an environmental negotiations into one that is heavily economic in nature. So in Panama, and actually in previous negotiating sessions, we have heard a lot of discussion about the use of market and non-market mechanisms as climate change mitigation measures. We have heard and seen many developing countries raise trade issues as well. For example, unilateral trade measures on the grounds of climate change as a key issue that needs to be addressed in the climate negotiations. We have seen many developing countries also raising intellectual property rights as a key element in technology transfer for climate change. In the climate financing discussions, for example, we have seen many countries raising different views about the use of private sector investments as a financing mechanism. And finally, one of the key underlying elements in the climate negotiations, which is very, very much relevant but to the WTO and to sustainable development in general, is that there are severe economic implications for arising from any kind of commitment that countries may take with respect to emission reductions. I think one could see it, especially for developing countries, as a question of shifting from a low carbon and poor economy, where most developing countries are right now, to a low carbon but industrialized or rich economy, hopefully in the future. And the question is how you get from here to there, from a low carbon poor to a low carbon rich economy. And that bridging issue is something that is very heavily economic, and is something that your climate change negotiators are trying to grapple with. The fourth key point I wish to raise is, therefore, in this discussion, in this heavily economic discussion in the climate negotiations, what is the role of intellectual property rights? Many developing countries view it as a key element in how technology transfer is going to be addressed in the climate change framework, and therefore what the role of technology transfer should be in promoting sustainable development. If you look at the UNFCCC as a negotiating framework, and if you look, I think, even to the WTO, for example, in the TRIPS agreement, you will see that technology transfer is seen as a major factor in spurring industrial growth in developing countries. And that implies looking seriously at what would be the policy regime that one could put in place to spur technology transfer. Intellectual property is going to be an important part of this, because especially in the context of climate change, in the sense that what we have seen over the past few years are studies coming out that clearly show that there is an increasing level of patenting going on with respect to renewable energy technologies. Most of that patenting is being done in developed countries. And what patenting are being done with respect to these renewable energy technologies in developing countries often are done by companies or enterprises that come from developed countries. There was a Chatham House study, for example, in 2009 that essentially concluded that when you look towards the next 10 or 20 years, say towards 2030, companies and enterprises from OECD countries are going to be are going still to take the lion's share, are still going to shape how the diffusion of technology in relation to climate-related technologies are going to take place. And that has severe implications in terms of the kinds of industrial policy, therefore, that developing countries could undertake, especially in terms of their access to the technologies that they may need to reshape their industrial infrastructure from one that is still very much fossil fuel intensive right now to ones that are not. So the issue of IPRs, of patents, for example, becoming barriers to technology transfer is an essential one that needs to be addressed. And the issue of IPRs also becoming innovation, an innovation regime also needs to be addressed if we are to really treat climate change as a challenge. In a sense, one is, the key issue here is, if we do, as a global community, do see climate change as the crisis that it is, then one would try to ensure that all barriers to addressing that challenge would be lifted. And if IPRs, if patents, for example, are going to be a barrier to the actual diffusion and innovation and production in developing countries of climate-related technologies, then it stands to logic that intellectual property rights as barriers should be addressed. It's something similar to the situation in the TRIPS and health that the TRIPS and Health Declaration tried to address back in 2001, where the issue of access to medicines in relation to HIV/AIDS was seen as a global crisis, and therefore the global community through the WTO acted in terms of saying that yes, you can actually use to the maximum the TRIPS flexibilities that currently exist in order to address this issue. But so far, in terms of the use of intellectual property regimes as either a barrier or as innovation sources for technology transfer, we have not reached that stage yet. Especially if one considers that technology transfer is going to be a key element in how we address sustainable development and climate change. The last point I wish to raise is this one. Even if we were to address IPRs and ensure that they do not become barriers to technology transfer to developing countries, we still have to address a predicate question as well. And one is, how do we address the constraints that many developing countries face in terms of the absorption of technology that might come their way as part of this overall package for climate change? We do understand that we do know that there continues to be a lot of constraints in terms of the capacity in many developing countries with respect to human skills, with respect to the ability to replicate technology, with respect to the ability to produce the technology, with respect to the ability to upscale technologies. And that those are predicate questions that need to be addressed, and therefore capacity building might need to be one of the elements when one talks about technology transfer. The second constraint that needs to be addressed is perhaps this issue of situating the proper role of intellectual property rights in the overall industrial policy and strategic development policy regime of countries. And this goes both for developed and developing countries. This therefore goes into looking at what would be the role of the state, in terms of shaping the appropriate policy regime by which technology transfer would become effective. Should the technology regime in developing countries be deregulated? In many developing countries, that might not necessarily work, especially if you have a weak state. Should the state play a major role in shaping and shifting the flow of technologies to particular sectors or particular activities? Again, as Richard was pointing out earlier, that is something that needs to be looked at in a specific country context. The third point in terms of addressing these constraints, of addressing this predicate question issue, is then looking at the extent to which the global community, through their international institute, how far, for example, has Article 4.4 of the UNFCCC been implemented by developed countries insofar as promoting technology transfer to developing countries have taken place. I think all of these are questions that many developing countries have raised in the UNFCCC, and I think these are also questions which are just as relevant in the WTO context, because it implies taking a serious look at the kind of strategic direction that we as a global community, and in which individual countries as well, should undertake in addressing climate change and sustainable development. The last point that I think needs to be raised is this issue of how do we do this at the developing country level. Many developing countries often have small economies. There are very few developing countries with economies the scale of or the size of, say, India or China. And that leaves us with a question of would industrial policy be effective if your economy were, say, the size of Togo? Which then brings us to the issue of how do you create economies of scale, and how do you create viable economies for many developing countries, when at the domestic national level, those economies might not be that sufficient or might not be that viable to become competitive in the international marketplace. And that therefore brings us to the question of what should be the proper role of regional integration, South-South regional integration, as a strategic industrial policy tool for developing countries, and what therefore would be the role of regional intellectual property regimes in this context. So just to go back to to conclude by going back to my first point, if we as a global community does see climate change as a crisis, which has to be addressed by promoting sustainable development across the board in both developed and developing countries, we have to, I think that the issue there is, what are the policy tools that we use? Intellectual property is going to be one of them. And in addressing and using intellectual property as a tool, we have to see it in its proper role and looking at it in terms of whether it's going to be a barrier or whether it's going to be an innovation source for developing countries. And that implies, therefore, looking at the whole, both multilateral and regional and domestic policy regime in terms of, especially in terms of technology transfer. Because it's going to be very important for ensuring and allowing developing countries to shift from where they are now, which are low carbon poor, to where we hope they could be, which would be low carbon rich economies in the future. Thank you.